Hello and welcome to another episode of Marcus and Alexander Explained. I'm your host, Jack Bannister, Marcus and Alexander's head of content. The Winter Olympics are underway in Beijing and it seems a far cry away from the Australian heat that we are witnessing here. So is anyone actually watching? If you had been, you would have noticed that several nations have instigated a diplomatic boycott of the Games, owing to alleged human rights abuses by China against its Uyghur population. As well as those nations, many businesses are caught in a bit of a tangle about what to do while these games roll on and what sort of social responsibility should fall on their shoulders. Joining me today to have a little discussion about the Winter Olympics and the strategic communications challenges that surround them is Marcus and Alexander's founder and director, Steve Markson. Steve, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks.
And I've also got with me Elise Gatt, Marcus and Alexander's newly minted senior associate. Welcome, Elise.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
So, you're both political heads and you're both keen watchers of all things that are going on in the world. Is anyone actually paying attention to the Winter Olympics while we bake in the middle of a hot Australian summer?
Oh, look, I have to admit that I've watched it a little bit. I haven't engaged that much. I think people are watching it, and I think there's a very specific interested audience in the Winter Olympics. That's the problem. That's the difference between the Winter and the Summer Olympics, I suppose.
I'm going to, at this point, make a confession to both of you, but also to all the audience that watches MA Explains, and that is that I have been watching Married at First Sight instead of watching the Winter Olympics in Beijing. So, I do love sport. I can't, and I do like snow sports. I can't say that I've been watching it closely though. But Jack, having said that, I reckon, Australians at large love their sport, and I don't reckon Channel 7 would be, airing so much of the Olympics if there wasn't the viewership. So if I was a betting man, which I have to say that I am during the Spring Carnival, I'd say that Aussies love their sport, and even for the Aussies who don't like winter sports, I reckon they'll be watching the Olympics in droves.
One of the narratives that's been going on around these games is, of course, centred on the diplomatic boycott. Given that that's kind of now been probably the most talked about thing for a number of months, and even the fact that we're having this conversation, is it fair to say that a geopolitical move like that that's come from Australia, the United States, the UK and several other allies is actually going to be somewhat effective, particularly in kind of raising awareness of human rights abuses that China is allegedly committing?
I think from my perspective, I don't think it's going to change things in China. I think this is sort of a single engagement on a broader strategy for the global population. It's part of the human rights issues, obviously very important, and obviously something that the rest of the audience, like a lay audience, can pick up on. But there's other issues that are going on with China, right? The rising threat of China in the region. Domestically, there's trade wars have been going on with Australia and China for quite a while. And I think this is just another tool in the toolbox of diplomatic relations. And I think if they didn't do this, if countries hadn't done this, there would be a bit of a backlash, a bit of a call of hypocrisy, I think, from the broader community when there's so much else going on in terms of the relationship with China.
I can't remember the precise episode, let alone the season of The West Wing. In fact, I think it is in season 1 where, President Bartlet is sort of challenged for the first time to respond to an attack on American citizens overseas, and there's this whole concept of proportionate response.
What is the virtue of a proportionate response? Why is it good?
And I think that the points that Elise makes are good ones insofar as will it change anything in China? It probably won't, but I do think that it has been a suitably proportionate response, and it has had some effect. Not least because we're talking about it today. And we have also seen, widespread mainstream media coverage, across Australia on the Olympics and also to some extent around the human rights aspects to the Olympic Games. And I think that's a good thing, I've got no doubt it'll be politicised by major political parties in a federal election year. But, I think that's a good thing because it means that, the next time there is a human rights violation, the next time as a country we're working through how we balance those human rights considerations with our economic interests. It's important that all Australians are broadly aware of what is going on so that, we can make the best decisions possible. So, I think it's a proportionate response. I don't think it's everything that could be done. But on balance, I think that, those nations who have boycotted have probably got it about right.
My only kind of counter to that would be if these are allegations of genocide, which they are, would an athlete boycott perhaps have been more effective or more proportionate?
And the risk of kind of drawing too long a bow, in answering that question, I think of the way that we traditionally approach political issues here in Australia, and that is, we saw last night Scott Morrison doing his long-form interview with his family on 60 Minutes, where the point was made there, and the same point I would make now, which is, we typically keep families out of political issues, and I think an extension of that is to keep athletes out of political issues. Now, there are appropriately some athletes who choose to proactively engage in political issues, and that's a good thing. But I think in terms of, nations making decisions about political issues on behalf of their athletes, I think that gets complex very, very quickly. But I think it misses a bigger point, which is that, sport transcends politics. Sport is about something that brings, in the case of the Olympics, nation states together. Appropriately people are going to be talking about those issues, Jack, that you talk about, around genocide and human rights. But I don't think that we should put athletes in the middle of that debate. I think that's something for countries to decide.
One of the things that you mentioned there is kind of whether athletes should be expected to weigh in or to, boycott. They're obviously barred at the Olympics from making political statements. And I'm gathering from what you said there, Steve, you're quite happy for the individual athletes to make a decision as to whether they should make political statements. There's no kind of belief that they should inherently have to comment on something like this.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the incredible power of the Black Power salute at the 1968 Olympics, those very brave athletes. I mean, you think about us talking about this in 2022, imagine what life was like in those days in 1968. So again, I think that if athletes want to weigh in, if they want to have a say, then they should do that. I also think, for completeness, that goes for spectators and supporters as well. But I also just think that, the reality is that some athletes don't want to weigh in, and so I think therefore that we risk compromising, their performance ultimately, but also really what the Olympics means if we sort of have countries taking positions on behalf of all of their athletes as opposed to as sort of in their diplomatic capacity.
It was interesting that you raised the 1968 Olympics. Peter Norman, who was on, who got silver and was one of the ones who was supporting the two African American athletes, was ostracised by the Australian Olympic Committee and the Australian community until well after his death in 2018, when the AOC issued him the Order of Merit. The risk for an athlete of standing up at the Olympics against something is great, and also you think about the other side of that. They're also sacrificing years of training and maybe their one shot of being at the Olympics. So it's a really complex issue, I think.
So we spoke there and you mentioned the risk that athletes face in making political statements. For businesses that are somewhat enshrined within the Olympic movement and have been long-term sponsors, this is a pretty tricky one. So, there are 5 US-based sponsors, including Coke, Intel, Airbnb, Procter & Gamble and Visa, who have said very little about their role with these games. Is that the approach that you would take, Steve? How can they acknowledge their own, corporate social responsibility without the kind of threat of ostracising, potentially the Chinese market, which would have a huge cost to their businesses?
I think more and more we are seeing, human rights issues becoming commercial issues, and I think that's a good thing, because I think that part of change in any society has to be across all of civil society, and I think that business community plays a big part of that. I think, notwithstanding that, if I was advising those 5 companies in that very delicate situation, I think the couple of things I'd say is firstly to make sure their own house is in order. So if I think about some of those companies who are actually tied up in this Beijing Olympics and who have had these questions put to them, a number of them have supply chains and manufacturing and production that takes place in China. So we need to make, my advice would be that we need to make sure that company absolutely has got its own house in order in terms of its supply chains and making sure there are no human rights or indeed any other violations that are taking place. But I also think, as a business, Michael Alexander provides, frank and fearless advice to companies, and I think I'd also say that those organisations should keep their heads down. Where they can find a sweet spot between their commercial interests and taking a proactive and positive position on the human rights agenda, absolutely that should be pursued. But I think as soon as a company does weigh into the human rights paradigm, then, as you pointed out, Jack, in your question, there can be very, very significant consequences for that. And I think importantly, through some of the behaviour that we've seen from the Chinese government, those consequences are not easily reversed or undone. They can be absolutely lasting. And, this is where we come to the point in the tension of rights, so we absolutely want to make sure there are no human rights, violations for the Uyghur people, but also we know that one of the extraordinary things that the Chinese government has done in recent times is to throw open the doors of their economy that has lifted literally tens of millions of Chinese into the middle class, and so that if we had a situation where a company was no longer able to operate in China, then that could literally mean that there were tens of thousands of Chinese who were suddenly without a job, and all that involves, and the impacts of that for their families and for those communities and those economies. So it is complex, and I think the final closing bit of advice I would say to any company in this situation is to monitor it very, very carefully, and that's both insofar as monitoring for risks and opportunities that may present themselves during the Olympics. For example, if there was a shift of some sort, I don't know what that would be, but if something's shifted, then you absolutely want to make sure that as a company you're not caught flat-footed and you can respond quickly. And of course, you need to make sure you're keeping an eye on what your competitors are doing, because if competitors in the market take a different position, then wherever possible, and certainly consistent with the advice we provide as a firm, we want to position our companies to be at the front of the pack, leading the way. You never want to be playing catch-ups. For example, if there was a company that came out and took a very strong position on human rights, and they were able to make that work and ultimately be commercial, then you'd want to be making sure that the company that we represented was ready to not, if not do that themselves, to definitely be able to respond to that very quickly.
I think I would just add that, I think the business, we're moving to a place where, the broader community expects businesses to live their values and not compromise on their values. And it's a really, really tricky space. I've come from the energy sector where, operates in some pretty, countries that require, a heavier level of investigation before you invest in there, and it is it's hard to sort of balance that, holding on to your values and holding on to a company's values and making sure that you're doing the right thing by where your money goes, but also trying to make money, and as Steve said, following on, making sure you're up with your competitors. I think as we move forward, though, there's going to be a lot more pressure from customers that companies do measure up.
And just kind of speaking to both of those points, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has identified 82 foreign and Chinese companies that directly or indirectly benefit from Uyghur workers in abusive labour transfer programs, which I think speaks to what you said, Steve, about making sure your own house is in order as a first port of call, because obviously if you've got an ethical issue in terms of your supply chains, that's a very hard thing to paper over, and as a business you do have a responsibility to look after that. I might move the conversation on now to talk a little bit about the IOC, and we picked this up right at the start of Michael St. Alexander Explains when we discussed Tokyo 2020. The IOC is always looking for gold medals to paper over any potentially negative media attention. Is there anything they can do specifically in this situation to maintain their reputation and their credibility? There's been a lot of attention and focus on whether these games should have moved to a different host city.
It's a tricky one. The IOC's a slow-moving beast. It's it's grounded in lots of complex history. Should they have changed the city? Probably. Personally, I think that they should have. Would they have? Very unlikely, because I think then that opens up a door to, a lot of countries, questioning whether it's worth hosting Olympic Games. There's a lot of risk involved, a lot of investment, a lot of money in hosting Olympic Games. If, then the Olympic Committee decides politically something in their country is going to not work well for the Olympics, the Olympic brand, our country's going to stop hosting Olympics. It's a tricky one. I'm not sure what would I advise the IOC to do. I'd advise them to start thinking about progressive changing how they operate, and starting to look and starting to be a bit more starting to look into countries and looking into host countries and options like that a bit more rigorously before the decision is made. I think after a decision is made for a country to host an Olympics, because of the amount of investment in it, it's a really tricky thing to change.
And they always tend to throw behind the political neutrality of the games, or hide behind the political neutrality of the games as their catch-all. I'll ask you kind of a couple of final questions to wrap up. So, Steve, at the opening ceremony, China enlisted a Uyghur athlete to light the Olympic flame. That was an obvious attempted deflection. The female athlete in question then disappeared and hasn't been made available for media comment. Would you suggest that stunt was advisable?
I would just come out and say whichever public relations firm was engaged by the Chinese government, or indeed whichever public relations arm of government was advising on that, it should be sacked. I mean, that is just a really terrible move. It's in poor taste. It represents, in my view, a very opportunistic attempt to try and cover up, frankly, what are some incredibly difficult human rights, concerns in China. And I think that my first thought actually is for the individual, involved, and I hope they're okay. And, we saw on 60 Minutes last night, after our long form story on Scott Morrison, the story of Peng Shuai and, the high profile, number one Chinese tennis player who, has got many questions around her well-being after she exposed alleged rape allegations against a high-profile, Chinese official. So, to answer your question, Jack, I think it was very, very, it was very, very poor, and I really I do feel for the individuals concerned.
I don't think it's a strategic comms kind of issue. I think it's reprehensible what happened, and I think it's I don't think obviously your advice on that situation would be engage the community that's absolutely affected, but making sure there's actually a change and there's actually remediation happening with that community and not just a PR stunt. It's a tricky one to answer from a strategic comms perspective, just because of how horrible it is.
So that's all we've got time for today. Thank you both for joining me. It's been a real pleasure. And make sure our listeners, if you are someone that has tuned in today, make sure you like and subscribe to the show. We'll be back in another couple of weeks with another episode of Michael St. Alexander Explains to break down another pressing issue.